I said to you in our first lecture that when you think about sacraments, you should be thinking about the here and now, what we're doing in the church, what you're doing in your parish, in your community, in your family, our present-day celebration of the sacraments. But having said that, I then took you off on a long journey into the past. And the reason I thought we had to do that was that what we're doing today when we celebrate a sacrament is not something that dropped from heaven, invented just today. It's something very old, something given to the disciples of Jesus 2,000 years ago, then handed on in the church. And in the handing on, the sacraments and thinking about them have been marked by many ups and downs, and they carry those marks in the way we receive them today. So the time we've spent looking at the long story of sacraments was not just to get historical knowledge, not to know what sacraments were like in the past, but to know what they are like today and why they are as they are. And we've seen that history only in its principal phases, its high moments. Finally, today we're getting to the phase that is closest to where we are at, that gives us the setting in which we will do our thinking and make our decisions about sacraments today, and that's the phase of the Second Vatican Council. And that's the title of our lecture, Vatican II on the Sacraments. We're not finished with the history yet, though. To understand Vatican II, we have to understand how the last phase we studied, that of the Council of Trent, played out over 3 to 4 centuries, and how Vatican II then came to mark the end of that phase and begin the one that we are in now. We saw the way the Council of Trent regulated theological thinking that was to be done in the Church about the sacraments. We need to add a word now, however briefly, about how the Council affected the practice of sacraments. As it finished its work, the Council committed to the Pope the task of having the actual practice of sacraments regulated, and to do that by the promulgation of new books that would lay down how the rites should be celebrated in the Church from then on. The first and most important of these books was the Roman Missal, which was promulgated by Pope St. Pius V in 1570. And that was followed then by books regulating the other sacraments, issued by him and by his successors. Now, the intention of those who composed these books was to restore, and in restoring to renew, the celebration of Mass and the other sacraments, and to do that, and it was their own phrase, the one they used, to do it according to the original norm of the Holy Fathers. It was to do what the Church had always been wanting to do about its celebration of sacraments from the very beginning. The Church had always wanted its celebration of sacraments to be faithful to what it had received from Jesus and the Apostles, and whenever it felt that things were not all that they might be and changes needed to be made, it was the apostolic tradition that was appealed to. The apostolic tradition, and then the Fathers of the Church, who are seen to be the most reliable guides to what that tradition is. So those who composed the Missal after the Council of Trent and the other books about sacraments, they did their best to study the Scriptures and to learn what the Fathers had to teach the Church about the sacraments. They hadn't, however, anything like the documentary resources for studying the past that we have in the Church today. Significant parts of the tradition were still a closed book to them, and they were at times led to assume, for want of contrary evidence, that some medieval practices and thinking were of apostolic origin. What they produced, in fact, as for them embodying the apostolic tradition, were really updated versions of the medieval forms of celebration. They did make corrections and improvements to the medieval forms on the basis of the teaching of the Council of Trent and of the much improved sense of pastoral care that the Church was now providing after the Council of Trent in what came to be called the Counter-Reformation. The rite of the Mass that they produced and the rites of the other sacraments that accompanied it had very many positive features, and they served the Church well in the centuries following the Reformation. They brought a sense of discipline and unity to practice in the Catholic Church, and they gave visible expression to Catholic teaching about the sacraments as defined by Trent, on the real presence of Jesus in the consecrated host, on the sacrificial nature of the Mass, and on the dignity and power of the ordained priest. And the form of Mass that they prescribed in the Missal also gave opportunities for aesthetic embellishment in music and art and pageantry and in architecture that could enhance the beauty of the rite, and these were availed of as the years went by. The question has to be raised, however, of the extent to which the new rites imposed by the Missal of Pius V and the other ritual books, how well they succeeded in fully offsetting the weaknesses that we have identified in the medieval forms of celebrating sacraments. Remember, we looked at the diminished sense of community and the dominant clericalism that was coming in, the privatization of sacramental practice, and the pervasive sense of legalism that began to emerge. For example, one can ask how much the Missal did to help recover the full sense of community that should be experienced in the celebration of Mass, and to modify the rather rampant clericalism that came through in the Middle Ages. What the Missal in fact prescribed was how the priest should celebrate the Mass. There was little or no provision in it for what the community of the baptized should contribute to the celebration. And that seemed to confirm rather than contradict the impression that the Mass belongs to the priest. It is he who celebrates it, and the community may or may not assist at it. And the Missal has the priest already doing quite a few things at the altar before he notices the congregation and turns around to say the first Dominus Vobiscum in their direction. He's been there for a little while and done his own things. And when he does say that first Dominus Vobiscum, he is to be answered not by the community, the congregation, but just by the server. For most of the Mass, he has his back turned to the congregation, and of course he's praying in Latin. One could claim that making the faithful feel they were simply watching what the clergy were doing for them at the altar was something that didn't really overcome that loss of community sense that had come to be part of the celebration of the Mass since the Middle Ages. And one could also think that the impression that they were being given made them feel like they would feel in other forms of public gathering that had a significant place in their lives in that Baroque age that flourished in the centuries after the Council of Trent. One of the great forms of public gathering was in the theatre. And there were indeed several features of the way the Mass was celebrated that made it seem like that the congregation was somewhat like an audience at a theatrical performance, and the church architecture and decor of those ages sometimes reinforced that. As regards the legalism that had become such a factor of the celebration of sacraments in the Middle Ages, the celebration was, after the Council of Trent, more regulated than ever. The Tridentine Missal and the other books as well set great store by what were called rubrics. These were detailed rules for every step of the celebration, what was to be done and what was not to be done, written in red in the book. read. The word for read is, the Latin word is ruber, so they were called the rubrics. Now that didn't help what was the main, didn't help to overcome what was the main risk of legalism. The deepest tradition about sacraments is that things are done and used and words are said because they are significant, because they're signs. Now, if the main reason that things were done was that they were done because the law prescribed them, then much less attention needs to be given to their significance. They were holy because they were commanded, not particularly because they were signs of holy things. The symbolic meaning of what was being done in sacraments had been rather weakened during the Middle Ages. The legalism inherent in the post-Tridentine books didn't really do a lot to help to restore it. In spite of these inadequacies, the books regulating the Mass and the other sacraments produced in the Church after the Council of Trent, they did serve the Church wonderfully well in the centuries following the Council of Trent, and during that period of the Counter-Reformation, the practice of sacraments was effective and fruitful in the Church. But the question was, how long would that last? In previous ages, sacramental practice had adapted gradually and quietly to changes that were occurring in people's life experiences, often without dramatic interventions by church authorities. The books emanating from the Council of Trent made no provision for adaptations. They were quite inflexible. Only the most minor changes were allowed to what was prescribed in them right up to around 1950. That was the books, but the world in which the Church was living was a world that was changing, and changed quite dramatically towards the end of the period we're looking at, by the 19th century. The world to which the post-Tridentine books had given an appropriate response had passed away, and a new world was beginning to come to light. Let me just mention a few of those changes. After the Council of Trent, religious differences that grew out of the Reformation continued to have a major effect on the politics and culture of Western Europe. But then new forces emerged in Europe that moved these issues off centre stage. And these forces came from new philosophical thinking that had bypassed the religious divides. They came out of a growing secularization of politics that diminished the significance of religion. And they came out of developments in the human and physical sciences that were daring to challenge religious assumptions. At the First Vatican Council, which was in 1889-90, the Catholic Church faced up to this changed world and took stock of how it was going to deal with it. And it realized that its struggle was now no longer with Protestantism and its consequences, but with a new world of philosophy, politics, and sciences. One of the consequences of the stand taken by Vatican I was that Catholic scholars began to take on the challenges of modern sciences, and particularly those coming from the historical and anthropological sciences. And some of the areas that they began to work in came to have profound consequences for the sacramental life of the Church. A new word that was really an old word began to come into use, the word liturgy. For a while that was used to refer to just the externals of Christian worship, but now in that period after the First Vatican Council, it was beginning to be used for the totality of the Church's life of prayer and sacramental celebration, the outside shape of it, but also the inner reality of it. Historians during this period began to study the past of the Church's life of prayer and sacramental celebrations, began to study its liturgy. They studied the Middle Ages and got a better sense of what was positive and creative at that era, but also of what was of lesser or dubious fidelity to the great church tradition. And that tradition was being brought to light by deepened historical studies of the patristic period with the help of many ancient manuscripts that were being discovered. Much that was new about the way sacraments were celebrated and thought about in the great beginnings of the tradition, the apostolic tradition, and that was coming to light. Most importantly of all, of course, in that use of history was the effect it had on biblical studies, because now ways were being found to discover what the scriptures were really saying about the origin of the sacraments, what Jesus and the apostles had to say about them. The fruits of these studies, after an early hiccup in the mistakes of modernism, began to show on the two levels of sacramental life that we've been examining throughout our lectures, the practice of sacraments and the theological thinking that was being done about them. Modest attempts began to be made to engage the faithful in Mass and in the Church's prayers and in the celebration of the sacraments. They were given vernacular missals to help them follow what was being done at the altar. They were encouraged to join in the responses in what came to be called dialogue masses, when not just the server but the whole congregation answered the priest when he addressed them. They were encouraged to sing, and they were encouraged to read the scriptures for themselves and above all to receive communion more frequently. This is what was called at the time the liturgical movement. And popes, starting with Pope St. Pius X and going on up to Pope Pius XII, they began to authorize the kind of changes that the liturgical movement was promoting. Pius X started the process on two foundational issues of liturgical renewal: the reception of the Eucharist. He was the Pope who restored communion to children at the earliest age when they would be capable of receiving. And he was the Pope who introduced congregational singing in Gregorian chant, not just of hymns and things that could accompany the liturgy, but on parts of the Mass itself, the proper parts which belonged to the congregation, encouraging the people to sing these. And then going on up to Pius XII, in the 1950s, as that movement was reaching its culmination, Pius XII authorized a major transformation of the liturgy of Easter. He had the medieval form of that liturgy completely replaced by a liturgy modelled on patristic forms and on the original shape of the Roman Rite. So that was in practice of sacramental life. On the level of thinking, the historical studies of the Bible and the Fathers and of the liturgy itself began to inspire a new way of thinking about the sacraments, a new kind of theology of sacraments. One strand of it was influenced by biblical and patristic studies on the notion of mystery. The deep meaning of that term in the scriptures and in the Fathers was recovered. The famous Benedictine Dom Oda Cassel was the great leader of that rediscovery. Other strands of it came from St. Thomas Aquinas, restoring, for example, the centrality he gave to the concept of sign for an understanding of sacraments. Other strands came from contemporary philosophy, from the existentialist and personalist philosophies that were prominent in the first half of the 20th century, developments in the philosophy of language. Ideas like personal encounter, for example, that came out of these philosophies were seen to be valuable for the theology of sacraments by somebody like Edward Skillebeck's. What came to be called systematic in the theology of sacraments had its developments, and the most important development there, the most sort of structured form given to the theology of sacraments, was something that rescued thinking about sacraments from the isolation it often suffered from in the layout of theological treatises. Research on the notion of mystery, and therefore of sacrament, which was the word that translated that into Latin and into English, researches on the meaning of those words reveal that the word primarily said something about God and about Christ and about the Church, and did that before it said something about the 7 principal rights of the Church. A theological framework was developed, for example by Edward Skillebeck's, which put the 7 rights of the Church, that are called sacraments, but put them at the climax of a sacramental series, a series that began with God. Christ is the sacrament of God, the Church is the sacrament of Christ, and the 7 sacraments are the realization of the Church's sacramentality. And among the sacraments themselves then, an order was seen among them. The Eucharist is the first and greatest of them, and the other 6 are articulated around it and from it and ordained to it. And when theology now spoke about the Eucharist, it was speaking about nothing more or less than the divine sacrifice of the Mass. The Mass wasn't something outside the sacraments, but at the very heart of sacramentality. So these were the pastoral and theological currents concerning sacrament that were being listened to by the fathers at the Second Vatican Council. It's no accident, or if it is, it's a happy accident, that the Constitution on the Liturgy was one of the first 2 documents promulgated by the Vatican II. When the Church looks at itself and sets about renewing its life at any particular point in its history, it has to look from the very beginning at the way it is celebrating sacraments. The Church is made by sacraments as it makes the sacraments. There was also a practical reason that let the Constitution on the Liturgy be the first of the Council's 4 great constitutions. Of all the areas that the Council Fathers would have to think about and make decisions about, that of the liturgy was the one on which the most theological and pastoral work had already been done, and which there was already a fairly significant consensus about what the Church should be teaching and doing. And good draft texts were ready for discussion by the Council Fathers, and their discussion didn't encounter serious obstacles and disagreements. And so they produced, at the end of their very first session, the Constitution on the Liturgy, called Sacrosanctum Concilium. I want to look today at the introduction and the first chapter of the Constitution that the Fathers gave the Church on the 4th of November in 1963 at the end of their first session. It gives the doctrinal principles and norms for practice that the Council thought should guide all thinking and practice about the sacraments in our day. The introduction to the Constitution situates the liturgy within the objective of the Council. And I hope you'll read that introduction for yourselves. It makes a general statement about what the liturgy is, and it uses words that by now are at the heart of theological thinking about the sacraments. It uses the word mystery. And it uses it here not of the individual rites that make up the liturgy, but of Christ, the mystery of Christ. It's going to be grounding its teaching about the seven sacraments on the Christ event that I've been saying to you from the beginning must be at the heart of all thinking about the sacraments. It also says in that first introductory paragraph that the liturgy, it says, manifests the real nature of the true church. So Christ and the church. If the church wants to show itself off for what it really is and what it sees itself as, then it can tell people to look at its liturgy. And then the text centres its statement about the liturgy on the Eucharist, which it calls the divine sacrifice of the Eucharist. So we're being invited then by the Council to do the kind of theological thinking about the sacraments that sees them in this series of sacramentality, starting with Christ, who is the sacrament of God, going on to the Church, which is the sacrament of Christ, and going on from there to the Eucharist, and from the Eucharist then to the other individual rites built around the Eucharist, which are what brings the Church's sacramentality and the sacramentality of the Eucharist and the sacramentality of Christ into the lives of God's people. And that's the way the Council itself proceeds in the arrangement of the chapters of the Constitution. That introduction to the Constitution gives a further significant lead for thinking about sacraments. We've seen from the very beginning in the text of St. Justin that we read right at the start how significant was the interaction of the visible and the invisible in explaining what the Eucharist is. Justin explains that interaction of the visible and the invisible by referring to the incarnation. The Word is made flesh, the hidden reality of the divine takes visible human form. And that sets a pattern in which those who seek salvation will find the divine in human things. And nowhere is that more true than in the human words of the Gospel and in the human signs of the sacraments. I'll quote part of the text of the Council on this. It is of the essence of the Church that she be both human and divine, visible and yet invisibly equipped. And she is all these things in such wise that in her the human is directed and subordinated to the divine, the visible likewise to the invisible. It goes on to illustrate that by descriptions of the life of the Church. After this introduction then, there's the first chapter of the Constitution, and it carries this general title, General Principles for the Restoration and Promotion of the Sacred Liturgy. And what it gives are principles both for thinking about the liturgy and for practicing it. The first paragraph of that first chapter is again a statement that thinking about the sacraments has to begin with God, and specifically about the once-for-all event of salvation that God accomplishes in Christ. Then themes and notions which will be needed again and again in the theology of sacraments are evoked. The coming together of humanity and divinity in Jesus, the humanity of Jesus being the instrument of the divine work, the work of Christ having this twofold movement, downwards in redemption and upwards in worship, something which, as St. Thomas said, has to be recognized in every sacrament. And the term paschal mystery is introduced to describe what is occurring in Christ. This is a term that is beginning to replace in theology the expression passion of Christ that medieval theologians, including St. Thomas, used to describe what in Christ was the source of the power that he gives to sacraments. The word paschal lets the death of Christ be seen as a passing over to new life in the resurrection, and the word mystery lets it be seen as a human event that is the work of God. This is what has to be realized again in every sacrament. And it is this paschal mystery which, as the text says, is born from the side of Christ, that, and I'm quoting it, the wondrous sacrament of the whole church comes into being. And in this opening statement of chapter 1, the word sacrament is introduced. It's the first use of the term in the Constitution, and in its first use it's being attributed not to the 7 rites of the Church, but to the Church itself. The next number in this first chapter, number 6, moves from what God is doing in Christ to what Christ is doing in the Church. He sent his apostles, we're told, the foundations of his church, sent them to do 2 things at one and the same time: to preach the gospel of salvation and to accomplish the work of salvation in sacrifice and sacraments. Word and sacrament. The opposition of the oppositions that came about in the Reformation between word and sacraments are no longer an issue. Protestants then were thought to be for the word, Catholics for sacraments. Word and sacraments go together. It was for that Jesus sent his apostles into the world. That's how they fulfill the mission of the church. There's no word without sacraments, no sacraments without word. And likewise, a distinction is made between sacrifice and sacrament in that, because the liturgy is described as being made up of sacrifice and sacraments, but there's no separation. They come together in the Eucharist to give the Church's liturgical life its core reality. That core reality is evoked in the Constitution by evoking just 2 of the sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, and doing so with attention to how the word is proclaimed in each of them. Again, there's no longer a fear of highlighting these 2 sacraments, and that by doing so one is doing what the Protestants did at the Council of Trent, saying that there are 2 sacraments and the other 5 acts of the Church are just ordinances. That fear has disappeared. The Council is able to see the liturgy of the Church embodied in its primary way in baptism and the Eucharist. The 7 sacraments are no longer to be seen like peas in a pod. They are an organic complex of life experiences that has the Eucharist at its summit and is entered into by baptism. Number 7 of that first chapter then tells theology how it should think about what has always been a central issue in the theology of sacraments, the issue of how the reality of the divine exists in human things. That issue, as you remember, took on particular urgency in the medieval discussions about how the body and blood of Christ exists in the bread and wine of the Eucharist. And the firm stand taken on how Christ is really, truly and substantially in the Eucharist, on the altar, the stand taken there marked Catholic theology forever. The notion of presence wasn't yet used about this being there of Christ in the Middle Ages. It was only at the Council of Trent, and there only when the chapters of the Council's teaching were being edited and given titles, that the term real presence came officially into the language of the Church. And it did, and subsequently affirmations of the real presence, meaning the real presence in the Eucharist, became the badge of Catholic theology. But one of the consequences of that was that there was a restriction of the term presence to what the Church believed about the consecrated bread and wine. And it was only about them that theology talked about real presence. But there were other forms of presence of God that Catholic faith and theology had always affirmed. God is in the events of salvation. God is in the world, in the word that proclaims that salvation. God is in the community gathered to pray. God is in the minister of the word and of the sacraments. God is in each of the sacraments. God is in the grace-filled soul. That being there of God, all those being there of God are presences, and they are very real. Vatican II says that the many dimensions of the real presence of God in the liturgy of the Church needs to be brought to light. I quote the text from it. Christ is always present in his Church, especially in her liturgical celebrations. He is present in the sacrifice of the Mass, not only in the person of the minister, the same now offering through the ministry of priests, who formally offered himself on the cross, but especially under the Eucharistic species. By his power he is present in the sacraments, so that when a man baptizes, it is really Christ himself who baptizes. He is present in his word, since it is he himself who speaks when the Holy Scriptures are read in the Church. He is present, lastly, when the Church prays and sings. For he promised, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. In its celebration of the sacrament, the Church brings into play each of these presences, where the Church is ensuring this total presence of Christ. He is with it, sanctifying the members of the Church and worshipping God with them. The Council then goes on to say that what the Church does in its liturgy are acts of the priesthood of Christ, acts simultaneously of sanctification and of worship, as St. Thomas noted long ago. They're signs perceptible to the senses, and the word sign is used, signs of the sanctification that's being realized, and not just signs that it is happening. The sacraments are signs that do what they signify, and they do it because everything that is done and being made manifest in the signs is being done by Christ. This paragraph then bears on the tradition of thinking about sacraments, both by what it says and what it does not say. It says sacraments are signs. Thomas had said that. The Council of Trent was afraid to say it because of what it thought was the mischievous way Protestants were using this theme of sign. Pius XII, in a wonderful encyclical he wrote on the liturgy in the 1940s called Mediator Dei, he avoided putting this notion of sign into his definition of the liturgy. But Vatican II is no longer afraid of it and sees the value of this concept for thinking about sacraments. And the paragraph says clearly that the sacraments do something, are not just signs. But this time it doesn't use the word that was used so much in medieval theology to express that side of sacraments. It doesn't use the term cause. Perhaps it was a term that had generated too many contentious theories in the history of scholastic theology. So things it uses and things it doesn't use. And the conclusion that the Council draws from the very rich teaching it has been given in these numbers 5 to 7 of its constitution, its conclusion is this: the sacraments must always be seen as the worship of the whole mystical body of Christ, head and members. This is what makes liturgical actions be sacred actions, which, as the Council said, there is nothing more sacred in the lives of the Church. So the clericalization and privatization that had been threatening sacraments since the Middle Ages seem to have no justification in the theological thinking about sacraments that is being promoted by the Council, nor, because it goes on to talk about other activities of the Church, devotional activities, nor from the way the Council presents things can these devotional alternatives ever take the place of the liturgy. The Council wanted to teach the Church about the nature and meaning of the liturgy, but it wanted even more to make that teaching guide a program of renewal in the practice of the liturgy. So it follows the first section of that first chapter of the Constitution with a section headed Promotion of Liturgical Instruction and Active Participation. Then it has a third section on the reform of the sacred liturgy. And in this text it lays down guidelines for the renewal of practice that it wants to see happening in the Church. For the doing of sacraments and for thinking about them well and practicing them well, you really do need to read especially this introduction and this first chapter, at least, of the Constitution on the liturgy, and we'll make access to it available to you. We'll be looking at the guidelines that the Council lay down in the second and third section of its first chapter, looking at how these were put into effect when we come in our remaining lectures to study how the Mass and the other sacraments are being celebrated today. At this point, I just want to draw attention to a few of the salient features of this program of renewal that's laid down there in the Council Constitution, and that will help us to understand the detail later on. And the first thing to note is the priority given to liturgical instruction. Instruction for all those with any responsibility for the carrying out of liturgy, especially those with pastoral responsibilities. The Council obviously thought that the level of education about matters liturgical was quite inadequate in the Church of that day. What they want is education, and education not just about the rules and regulations of how sacraments should be performed, the kind of thing that a legalistic approach to the liturgy had grown accustomed to for too long. What they're requiring is that liturgy be studied, and it's the Council's own phrase, under its theological, historical, spiritual, pastoral and juridical aspects. And the Council is thinking of pastors especially, who must receive this kind of education. Without it, they can't make their understanding of the liturgy be what the Council wants it to be, and can't make that available in theory and in practice to their congregations. A very interesting feature of the guidelines about liturgical education is that from the first line in a passage that will become famous, the education is put at the service of the Church's desire, and I'm quoting from the Council now, that all the faithful should be led to that full, conscious and active participation by all the faithful in liturgical celebrations, which is demanded by the very nature of the liturgy. such participation by the Christian people as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a redeemed people, from 1 Peter chapter 2, it is their right and duty by reason of their baptism. So this active participation isn't just a pastoral strategy, a way that might get things done. It's something that's demanded by the very nature of the liturgy and is the right and duty of all the faithful by reason of their baptism. So not an optional extra, but required by what the liturgy is and by who the practitioners of it are. A second thing to note from those guidelines for practice is the justification that's given for the restoration of the liturgy that the Council wants to happen. It says that the liturgy is made up of immutable elements, divinely instituted, and of elements subject to change. These not only may, that's the one subject to change, but ought to be changed with the passage of time, if they have suffered from the intrusion of anything out of harmony with the inner nature of the liturgy or have become unsuited to it. That's something we've been thinking about all through these lectures, the unchangeable that's given in the apostolic tradition and the changeable that has come, stayed or gone away over the centuries. And we see how this is worked out in the period that follows the Council when we're coming to examine the individual sacraments. Note also that in these guidelines, meaning and good sense is seen to be important in the rites. Again, I quote the Council, it says, "The rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and unencumbered by useless repetitions. They should be within the people's power of comprehension, and normally should not require much explanation." And finally, I draw your attention to something that affects the issue that we've seen of legalism. The heavy legalistic uniformity of the post-Tridentine days is to be relaxed. And that is expressed by a text of the Council that says, "Even in the liturgy, the Church has no wish to impose a rigid uniformity in matters which do not implicate the faith or the good of the whole community. Rather does she respect and foster the genius and talents of the various races and peoples. Provision, it says, shall also be made, when revising the liturgical books, for legitimate variations and adaptations to different groups, regions and peoples. And this should be borne in mind when drawing up the rites and devising the rubrics." So against that background of Vatican II teaching, we can go on in our remaining lectures to think about the individual sacraments, starting with the Eucharist, and to do that in a contemporary way.